Let's take a moment and thank our sponsor, Text Control. There's always something new from Text Control. As a developer, do you need to integrate PDF generation, document editing, or electronic signatures into your ASP.NET Core or Angular applications? Or maybe you want to learn more about the differences between electronic and digital signatures. Text Control is offering a free consulting service to educate you about digital document processing and how Text Control products can help you add these features to your applications. You just go to textcontrol.com/contact and you can request your free personal consultation. How cool is that? Textcontrol.com/contact and you can request a free personal consultation from our friends at Text Control. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hanselminutes, and today I'm chatting with Nathan Allebach. He's a creative director at Allebach Communications and a lover of walkable communities. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So you're known for a lot of things. You're a marketeer. People might be interested that you got kind of low-key famous because you are the Steakums Twitter guy, or at least were for a while. And while that's interesting and probably deserving, honestly, of its own podcast, I found you online walking and talking about walkability. And it really stuck with me. Like it stuck with me and I went off and researched and read books. Why is walkability so important? And why did you become that person?
That's super cool to know that you found me that way, because it has been my my life goal the past couple years to do something online that got my name attached to a thing besides the Steakum Twitter. So very, very cool. To
be clear, I just learned you were the Steakum Twitter person when I was researching your work on walkability. So
right.
Don't want to talk about that. So yes, I appreciate your work.
we can get into whatever you want to get into, but yeah, I mean, so like walkability generally is kind of like it's a term that's used in several different ways within several different communities. Like I've brought it up to friends and coworkers at times, and when they hear it, they think like, oh yeah, like I would love to live in a walkable place. Like they think sidewalks, like, oh, like I can just walk to the park, or, you know, like there's infrastructure to walk. And while obviously that's kind of like bare minimum, a starting point for like what makes a place walkable, there's really this spectrum of how we define it with places. And kind of right now in the culture war zeitgeist, there's a lot of heated discourse over 15-minute cities or 15-minute neighborhoods. This whole concept of being able to reach like most or all of your basic needs within either a 15-minute walk or a 15-minute bike ride or transit ride. And that's honestly like a pretty succinct way to sum up what walkability really is. It's really the idea that you want to build places where people have access to places that they want to get to. So that whether that's schools, offices, restaurants, grocery stores, coffee shops, or like more broadly speaking, third places like cafes, parks, and so on. So you want places that have those things nearby, but then you also need the infrastructure that provides people a safe, beautiful, interesting walk to get there. And that's the sort of framework that the author Jeff Speck uses, who wrote the book Walkable City, and he's kind of one of the top purveyors of this line of thinking. And kind of, so like walkability more broadly then kind of fits within this umbrella of what's kind of referred to as urbanism, which is this whole quasi movement around just building better places. So building better cities, better small towns, better neighborhoods, and how to kind of center people who would be walking or rolling or riding a bike, either just as much or even more than cars. So right now, like if you think about most of North America, including America, Canada, and some parts of Central and South America, although it's not as bad in many of in the countries within that region, but especially in North America, our sort of a development pattern the past several decades has really like centered around automobile travel. So like when you think about cities, whether it's a small town or a large city, really the way traffic moves is centered around cars. So you think like highways cut through city centers. A lot of our main streets in downtowns are essentially commuter roads for people to drive through. at this point. So a lot of the movements and the sort of talking points that center within urbanism are about how to kind of get back to how communities were built prior to the automobile for centuries, honestly, which is around the primary mode of transportation being walking and riding a horse, if you were lucky back then. So yeah, that's generally why and it's important for a range of reasons. I know that was your original question, which is to say we get into health benefits around building more walkable places. There's environmental benefits in terms of people living in more compact neighborhoods where you don't need a car to get everywhere. There's sort of like social benefits when you think about the idea of social infrastructure, meaning like people, when they live closer together, you have more access to sort of chance encounters and like community activities. Whereas like if you need to drive somewhere, let's say 15 or 30 minutes, that's going to dramatically decrease the probability of you running into a friend or making plans with somebody, because those all become, that time and that driving becomes a barrier essentially to your social participation. So we can get into all the direct benefits, but that's kind of like a big umbrella way of thinking about it.
That's a great primer, but one of the things that really makes me sad when we talk about walkability is that we're not having like factual conversations about walkability and its benefits. It turns into culture wars, which you alluded to at the beginning. And I've always been a strong believer in the idea that traveling somewhere is an opportunity for you to see not only how people live, but that those people will very likely never come to where you live. And they might very well think the way you live is crazy. So we should look at all the different places and pick the style of living that makes us happy and either bring it here or move there. So when you talk about how in America we would love to have a world where we are walkable and we can get to food and movies and art and culture and our family within, maybe a half an hour walk. I have seen us turn that into, well, I'll make a super apartment building with its own mall and its own private club that's only for the people who live in that apartment. And then we think that's amazing. And all we end up doing is building a bubble for people to live in where they don't even have to leave the building, and then think that that's a walkable solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think a lot of the sort of hesitation around like when people hear walkability or the idea of building more walkable places is exactly that, where they imagine whether it be, skyscrapers or tall mid-rises, or maybe it's on the flip side of like realty. Maybe they think there's like this kind of like real estate cabal of people that are buying up a bunch of properties and they're kind of trying to artificially create a sort of a community from scratch or from the top down. And I think that does create a lot of issues, because when you look about a lot of the newer developments that we see today, I mean, these aren't necessarily meccas of walkability. Oftentimes, like the buildings don't look great, so there's a lot of sort of like architectural and like aesthetic discourses that happen when people see new apartment buildings. And there's also, like you said, just kind of more of like this broad culture war where if you live in a rural community and you hear people talking about this, your sort of brain goes right to Manhattan. Like you start to think like, well, I live out like whether it's in the woods or out in like a farmland or just like, say like Appalachia or something. And, you don't want your small town to become this like big urban center. And then vice versa, when people live in these urban centers, they think like, man, like people that are out in rural areas or like suburban areas, they just like don't get it. And they're out there just, like eating up resources and tax dollars. And we're not getting anything back from that. And really there's like this give and a take, obviously, like between these two different cultural sort of parts of the country, or parts of, countries all around the world, which is to say like you need rural communities for like various forms of like agriculture and resources. And you got people that just generally want that more open space. And then you've got people that, like live in these bigger city centers, and that's where most jobs are. And that's where most of like the sort of like tip of the spear of cultural influence lies. So I think, having that kind of cross experience for sure, like can help bridge some of these gaps. But I think more broadly speaking, whenever I get talking to people about this stuff, I always say it really doesn't matter if you live in a rural community or you live in a suburban downtown or you live in a city center. A lot of the principles around walkability still broadly apply, because, if let's say you're in a rural community in Appalachia and there's like a downtown where you get your groceries, and there's barbershops or what have you. And then most people in that area, they live a 10-minute or a 15-minute or a 30-minute drive from that downtown area. The ideas around walkability are that we need to kind of revitalize and restructure how we build places starting in those urban cores. So it doesn't really matter if you're in a suburban town or a rural town. You still have those urban cores where people spend money, they go grocery shopping, they get their daily needs. So I think that's really where the conversation starts and ends when you talk about building these places, because wherever you are, I mean, like there's going to be sort of back roads where people live that are never going to, you're never going to like be developing out a road that's, that far away from where most of our urban cores are in that way. Right. So I think they're just kind of different conversations that people get lost in.
Right. And I think there's also how you ended up there. I tell people I live in Portland, but I actually live in a rural community outside Portland. And the reason that I'm here is I didn't have enough money to live where I wanted to live in a walkable community in Portland. So I headed in a direction away from the city until the size of the house I wanted matched the amount of money I had. And then I ended up in the suburbs somewhere. And, civilization is 20 minutes away. And I am just every single day longing for a walkable community. And then when I travel to Europe, particularly anywhere, really just anywhere in Europe, Western Europe, I just go, this would have been perfect if we did it like this. And then if I say that to someone and we're on the wrong side of the culture war, well, I'm some West Coast liberal who wants, socialism. It's like, no, I just want to be able to walk to the store.
And I think too, like part of the issue is right there, where like I've seen this time and time again with TikToks I've made or tweets I've put out, where inevitably when you advocate for this type of thing, you have people out there who see what you're saying, and their sort of knee-jerk reaction is, well, you do whatever you want, but I don't want you imposing sort of your lifestyle on me. And the reality is it's actually the opposite right now in most of North America, and that's why this whole movement around urbanism and building more walkable places has gained traction, because it's kind of boring and esoteric, but now we're kind of getting into the zeitgeist, this whole idea that zoning, permitting, and parking laws really across the country make it so that building these types of places is de facto illegal. So it's not that, I want to live a certain way and you want to live a certain way and that's all good. It's right now, it's that the status quo is that for the vast majority of new development going on in the country, it's single family homes with large lots of land that have minimum lot size requirements, minimum square footage requirements, mandatory setback requirements where, the house has to be set back 20, 30, 50 feet from the road. All these different, and then you have minimum parking requirements where if you want to build, whether it's a new house or you want to open up a new business, the permitting behind that requires you to have X amount of parking spots per the occupancy of that building. So you run into all these sort of regulatory issues where it essentially becomes an impossible task to build these walkable places. And I think that's why there's been this kind of thrust behind urbanism in the past few years, because as people are getting excited about the prospect of, like you said, European cities are almost always at the top of the list, at least in our sort of Western context, when people think like, oh yeah, I've been to Italy, I've been to England, or I've been to France. And you think about, the transit system there, you think about the way that these neighborhoods are sort of built, and why is it not that way in America? And the reality is that it used to be this way for hundreds of years in America. And it wasn't until the advent of the automobile and how we started to redevelop to so much of the country around the automobile that everything changed, and we started to kind of develop out into these suburban neighborhoods that were sprawled with a lot of space between every house. And rather than it becoming this kind of organic thing where it was just like, oh, this is just the way it is now, it was actually set in place by a lot of laws that essentially made any alternatives impossible.
Some people would argue that the reason that we can't do it like Europe and the kind of the well, actually, answer that I get from people who disagree that this isn't possible is, well, it's just, we're too big. People just don't realize the U.S. is just too large. We're too spread out. We had to have the railroad in World War II, and everyone's so far apart. Is that a valid argument that we're just too big, and the way Europe can do it is just simply density?
No, because it's the same when you look at density. Texas is a great example of this, right? Because Texas is one of the large. I think it is the largest state. Maybe Alaska is bigger than Texas, but Texas is one of the largest states in the U.S. And when you look at the actual map of population density, the vast majority of people in Texas would live within just a few hours of each other. So it's like when you think about how the highway system works, or how a sort of idealized transit system could work. In that context, it wouldn't be that different from how the distance between, major European cities or countries that are kind of neighboring each other. I do think, when you see these viral idealized maps that go through Twitter once in a while, where you see somebody kind of creates this mega rail system that connects the entire country. I do think those tend to be fantastical because you're right. Geographically, we can't connect all of the United States the way most of Europe can be connected, because Europe is much smaller and much more compact. But when you look at the population density of the country, there's no reason we wouldn't be able to connect, large swaths of where these interconnected cities are. So you think you could have a rail line from the top down the West Coast, one similarly in the Rocky Mountains, one in the South, one up in the East Coast corridor. There's a lot of different densely populated pockets of the U.S. where you could build out a similar system. And that's only speaking to transit. I think, again, when we go back to how we build individualized neighborhoods and towns to become more walkable, this is really a highly localized issue. Prior to World War II, every town, every city was built like this. It's not like the U.S. started as this sort of sprawl. And this is just the way it's always been. There's this great account on Instagram I think it's called Cars Destroying Our Cities, or Cars Destroyed Our Cities. Very provocative username, but this person just basically posts these before and after pictures that show a Google Maps shot of an existing city or town today, and then shows a side-by-side of what that town looked like about 100 years ago. And it's extremely... it's very effective because of that visualization. You can see in all these different cases how, we essentially just plowed through all of our small towns, all of our cities with these major highway systems during the urban renewal period of the past, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and just basically gutted all these walkable places and filled them with parking lots and highways. So it's really... To me, it's the bigger question is not necessarily can we connect all of America. It's more so, can we get back to at a localized level to just building out these urban cores that still exist in the downtowns of most rural, suburban, and large urban centers across the country.
Yeah, the Cars Destroyed Our City Instagram is really visceral because it's making a statement, but it's just simply showing the exact same angle from the exact same location. There's nothing to argue about. It's not manipulated. It's just, here's a shot of this street in 2015, and here's the same street in 2022. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's bad. And your example about parking lots, though, actually speaks directly to the idea that we are too big. We had all this room, therefore we could make parking lots. So we have these fields of asphalt, and we have more parking spots than we have cars, in the suburbs. And that does no one any good. They're just places that are waiting for us to drive to park in order to buy stuff, in order to drive back. And I'd love to get rid of my car myself.
Yeah. And there's truth to that, but there's also truth on the flip side, which is that throughout the urban renewal period and even today, there's so many parts of our towns and our neighborhoods that were sort of these compact, whether it might have been let's say a fourplex or a multiplex or a mixed use building or something of that nature. And let's say, after 10 years, it either fell into disrepair or, the landlord, moved out or something of that nature. And then rather than that, when that gets torn down, rather than that being replaced with more housing of some sort, it often just becomes a parking lot. And that's sort of the trend that we've seen the past several decades, where it's like you look at a lot of these towns and cities and the sort of surface area. It's not necessarily that they expanded out with their parking. It's that the parking actually gutted them from the inside, which is a really, I see it in the town where I work. I mean, it's the town where my wife grew up in as well, which are both these kind of downtown streetcar suburb type places that have the bones to be really walkable. But man, it's like the downtown is essentially half parking lot, which is just wild, because at that point, it's like when you're walking through it, while you might come across some cool buildings or nice places or whatever, it's like half the walk that you're going through is essentially just asphalt and places for cars to sit for most of the day. So it's really, and I think people hear that kind of thing and they think, well, I got to drive. Like I have to get places. And it's like, we all do right now. But I think if you take a step back, you can see how it's a self-perpetuating cycle. It's like the more we build places around these cars, obviously the more everybody needs a car to live. So at some point, it's like the laws and the incentive structures have to change if we want to start building better places that are actually worth spending time in. Because at this point, we know, I mean, as well as I do, you just said it with Portland. At this point, the most walkable places in the country, whether it be large cities or small towns, they tend to be the most expensive places to live because we've made them so rare that the scarcity of the market drives the housing prices through the roof. So it's not a matter of like, oh my gosh, like every walkable place has to be so expensive. It's more the fact that we've made it illegal to build them virtually everywhere. So if you want to live in one of these pre-existing walkable places, yeah, you end up paying a premium for it, which, sort of just perpetuates this cycle where a place like Portland, where like there's neighborhoods by me that have, again, like much more sort of like walkable bones to them, they essentially become either wealthy neighborhoods or tourist attractions because it's the only thing like that in the 30-minute or 45-minute vicinity. And then people from all these surrounding suburbs and small towns drive in on the evenings and on the weekends to spend time there. So it's like,
that is so true. Everyone wants to go hang out at the farmers market, but no one wants to live in the building 2 stories above the farmers market.
Exactly.
You actually have this great tweet I'll link to in the show notes that refers to NIMBYs. I want to hear about NIMBYs and what those are, but it basically is a picture of a 3-story, kind of a building. It's got a shop underneath and then livable apartments above. And someone says, why is this not allowed? This is genius. And you said, well, residential neighborhoods, they block mixed use buildings because people want the benefit of those places existing, but no one wants to put up with living over a bodega.
Yeah.
It's not on the West Coast.
Exactly. And like, I'll steel man the NIMBYs just for a second here, because I think there's a sort of,
and define that for our friends who may not be familiar.
Sure. Yeah. NIMBY just stands for Not in My Backyard. And the acronym originated, I believe, in the 1960s or so. And it was originally geared more toward people, I believe, who were mostly environmentalists, who were opposing certain development. But then it kind of colloquially became referred to as mostly suburban white homeowners who were basically blocking new housing in their neighborhoods for people of color, Black people who were moving in from the cities, where they essentially were saying, if you look back at like the history of the suburbs in post World War II, you had like these grants, like the GI Bill, which essentially gave all these veterans who were coming home this big boost of money. And then there were these developers coming in making these kind of little suburban ranchers and houses. Is where the whole idea of like Levittown came to be, where they would they'd be building these houses like in mass, like right outside of cities, like hundreds, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of them. And these like the grants from the GI Bill were only, for the vast majority, only applied to white people. So what happened is that pre-World War II, you had all these white families living in these kind of dense city centers around the country. And then after World War II, once these grants started happening and these new developments started getting built outside of cities, you had the sort of advent of white flight, where all these families started to move out, and then the cities remained filled with like segregated neighborhoods and pockets of different minority communities. And essentially, as different minority communities tried to escape the parts of the city and move into these suburbs, not only were there, laws on the books preventing that, and there were banks literally like denying loans to Black families and all of that, but there were white homeowners who would literally be on the ground protesting against these people moving in to their neighborhoods. So it became this whole thing, and that's kind of the origins of the term broadly. Like I said, there was a lot of usage around it with the environmentalist movement, because certain forms of development in the 1960s and 70s, you'd have, like, whether it be pipelines or like large forms of development kind of impeding on different like nature reserves and things like that. So obviously, like, not all NIMBYism is necessarily created equal. But as we find today, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's like a explicitly racist person living next to you who doesn't want minorities in their community, or it's someone who is just like opposing a new building based on aesthetic preferences. Really, the end result ends up being the same, which is that people, for whatever reasoning they might have, it might be noise complaints. They might think like, oh, I don't want new neighbors because that means there's more cars on the street, there's more activity near me, or if a building goes up next to my house, maybe that'll block the sun. Like, there's all these, really an endless list of reasons that NIMBYs come up with for blocking housing. But like I said earlier, really the end result has been the same, which is this set of exclusionary zoning laws around parking, around single family zoning, which essentially like only allows single family homes in a neighborhood. And then you have all these sort of like nitpicky permitting regulations as well, that essentially, even if you made it legal, quote, like on the books to build, let's say, like you said, a mixed use building with like a salon on the first floor and apartments above it, you would still have to go through this ringer of other permitting issues to kind of get that passed at the local level. So NIMBYs make it so, it could literally even be something that completely passes everything on the books, and oftentimes they will still show up at city council meetings and protest it and cause a scene, which will end up causing delays and oftentimes leads to builders or developers completely abandoning projects altogether. So it's a kind of a mess, and again, currently it's almost the status quo almost everywhere in North America, because these laws are set everywhere, and NIMBYs, being property owners and local stakeholders that tend to be older, whiter, and wealthier, have an outsized voice comparatively to newcomers trying to come into an area, or like a young entrepreneur trying to open a business or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things that I don't know if it happened in Philadelphia where you are, but out here in Portland, one of the great things that happened during the pandemic is we needed places to eat. Mm-hmm. So we didn't want to go inside. So we spilled out onto the street, and we took a lane of traffic and turned it into outdoor eating. And everyone's like, when the pandemic is over, let's keep this. This was genius. And as much as we want it, every single person I've heard has said that this is a great thing. They're still slowly pushing these great little outside eating areas off the street. We had an opportunity there, and it feels like in some of our cities, at least, we're going to go and shove those right back into buildings. We're missing that opportunity.
Yeah, I wish I had the numbers on hand, but if anyone's interested, listen, you can look up strong towns and Philadelphia streeteries, and the article should come up right away. But that was exactly the case in Philly, where a bunch of side streets and even some main commuter roads, they'd surrender either a bike lane or one lane for these streeteries, and super popular. And I believe it was literally just at the end of last year, Philly had announced this new permitting program where they were going to be requiring all the existing streeteries, which I believe that at the peak of the pandemic, there was about 400 of them. I believe up until mid last year, that was about halved already. But still, I mean, several hundred of these places all throughout the city. And when the permitting process came through, I believe 50 of those streeteries applied and none of them passed. So it created this mass uproar, because once the permitting program was passed, all of the restaurants that had received the notice essentially just they just closed shop, because they just didn't want to deal with the fines and all of that. And even the ones who tried to do it couldn't meet the standards that were being set. So There's been a bit of chatter of trying to like reform that. Like the city council has taken note of people's concerns over it. But to your point, at this point, we're kind of, working behind the 8 ball here, because now all those places are gone, and to get them back is going to be a major uphill battle. So even if everything was reformed today and everything was set right, I can't imagine we would see more than 25 or 30% of those places come back. And it's a shame. It really was a chance for a great reset for towns and cities across the country, and a lot of it's just being re-bulldozed for cars again.
Yeah. And for context, for folks that may not be familiar, this word streetery, right? It's a street plus an eatery. It's a portmanteau of that. And we can see articles in 2021 that say things like, these Philadelphia restaurants are the most beautiful streeteries. And streeteries have signified many things to Philadelphians. And then simply a year later, there's a $1,750 annual license to be a streetery. And there's this fight between, do we want regulations? Are the regulations a gut punch or not? And by the time people start to complain, it's too late and they've already quashed them. So how do you go from, in a single year, articles in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the most beautiful streeteries in Philadelphia to this is the end of them, and we did it with just simply licensing that was too expensive?
And it really just shows the power that car usage has in this country, because the vast majority of Americans, they drive to get everywhere. And I do some work for Strong Towns, which is the organization I just mentioned that covered this story. And one of the phrases that we come back to a lot internally and then through some of the content that we make is this idea that we want to build places for people to linger in instead of just passing through. And I think when you build places that people actually want to spend time in, it changes the entire dynamic of a street, of a neighborhood, of a town. That place starts to raise exponentially more tax revenue because it becomes more of a destination that people want to be at. It becomes more of a productive place, as in people just, you get more foot traffic, businesses do better, public life is better. Like I mentioned at the beginning, you establish more of these sort of social institutions like third places where people can run into each other randomly on the street or in a coffee shop or something like that. And it's really a shame because, in this case with the streeteries going out, it's like we've surrendered all these parts of the city where people could actually spend time, and they could really these streets could kind of come alive. If you saw a picture of them, they often look like European cities, especially during the pandemic. But now when you look at those same streets, it's literally just a commuter road. Like there's nobody walking on, very few people walking on those sidewalks, and there's just cars going through. And unfortunately, that's just the status quo virtually everywhere right now. So it's really, when I think about the future and kind of where we're at now in this kind of umbrella of urbanist movements, that's the battle is with zoning and with parking laws, because that's where all of this has to start. And even if we were to reform nationwide our zoning and parking laws, really that's just step one, because we have to kind of fundamentally rethink how we build places, which currently it's not only that we're building places just for cars, we're building places for cars at the expense of other forms of transportation. And I think that's really the issue that a lot of people don't see.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for sharing your passion with us for walkable cities. And it sounds like we want to encourage our audience to go to strongtowns.org to learn more about their strong town and what they can potentially do if they want to change how that planning and that urban sprawl happens where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you having me on, Scott. It's been fun chatting. And if anybody is interested in the sort of more the broad movement around urbanism or walkability, I'm always down to chat or send folks resources. I know you said you've been reading some great books as well, so it's a good topic to be interested in these days.
Absolutely. I'm going to put links in the show notes to things like Jane Jacobs' Center for the Living City, your articles on third places, strong towns, and more. And you can follow Nathan all over social media. We've been chatting with Nathan Allebach, Creative Director at Allebach Communications. And this has been another episode of Hanselminutes. And we'll see you again next week.